Welcome to week 12, April 1st. This is our penultimate week of this course, VISM 4003 Contemporary Documentary Media. And the topic of this week is Uncanny Returns, Documentary and Animation in the New Documentary Ecology. So this week belongs to the third unit of the course, which concerns what I've called emerging and consolidating forms and trends. And when we think about animation and its relationship to the documentary, we will see how it really fits into both an emergent trend as well as something that actually has a much longer history that is really consolidating itself in the 21st century. So for this week, I asked that we watch a handful of films, including Winsor McCay's 1918 The Sinking of the Lusitania, Nick Park's 1989 Creature Comforts, Tim Webb's 1992 A is for Autism, Bob Sabiston's short Rotoshop piece from 1999, Snack and Drink, and finally Chris Landreth's 2004 National Film Board of Canada documentary, Ryan. And we had one reading for this week, Annabelle Honus-Rose, The Evolution of Animated Documentary, which was part of the edited collection, New Documentary Ecologies, Emerging Platforms, Practices, and Discourses. I also recommended an additional reading from Annabelle Honus-Rose, as well as Steve Foer's essay on Ryan entitled Reenacting Ryan, the Phantasmatic and the Animated Documentary. So I've broken this lecture down into two parts. The first half has a discussion of what I will call the shared history of animation and documentary, followed up by a brief discussion of the sort of media ecology of animated documentary in the 21st century. And then the second part will take up questions of animation, collaboration, and the visualization of mental life, and finally questions and discussion topics. So, first, we will consider the shared history of animation and documentary. And I think one of the things I just want to emphasize here is how animation goes all the way back, of course, to the origins of cinema and even proto-cinematic devices, optical devices, and so forth. And in fact, it actually shares much also with the emergence of what we call documentary. And we remember that the notion of film as a documentary really only emerged in the 1920s when the Scottish documentary filmmaker and organizer John Grierson, of course, in referring to Flaherty's film Moana, as well as Nanook of the North, described these two films from the 1920s, these kind of quasi-ethnographic films, as possessing documentary value, quote unquote, documentary value. And he also said in 1926, when he described these two films by Flaherty as possessing documentary value, he also described around this period about how the documentary is what he called the creative treatment of actuality. And this kind of open-ended sort of notion of the documentary, I think, very much speaks to also its imbrication with animation. Because as we'll see in our discussion, as I'm sure we know from many examples we could think of in terms of animation in the documentary or fully animated documentaries, is that on the one hand, these animated documentaries make appeals, of course, to the real world and depict in various ways as dimensions of the real world, including realistic depictions or depictions, I should say, of interior mental life, and of psychology and of particular points of view and specific experiences. So there is a kind of realism, we might say, inside of uses of animation. There's a realist dimension, but of course there is also a highly self-reflexive modernist dimension to animation, one that we might see as distancing and critiquing some of the epistemological claims of the realist documentary. So there's at least two dimensions to animation and the way it functions inside of nonfiction discourse, right? It can support it in terms of realism, and it can also be an internal kind of critique or distancing inside of it. So this is the type of discussion that can take us into Annabelle Honus-Rose, The Evolution of Animated Documentary. And very early on in her essay, she writes that animated documentaries contravene many of the commonly accepted traits of documentary film and television, such as, for example, observational fly-on-the-wall filming and archival footage, photographic-based elements that perpetuate the notion of the camera standing in for the viewer as an unobtrusive eyewitness to events as they unfold. So already we see here in Rowe's argument how animation um, seems to question a kind of perhaps popular or naive idea of the documentary is simply rooted in observational cinematography, which is also related to this notion of neutrality or non-intervention on the part of the filmmaker. And as we've seen throughout this course, there are myriad examples of documentaries, especially after the 1960s, that questioned this orthodoxy of observational cinematography and non-intervention, right? So animation is also, I think, very much part of this um, expanded sense of the documentary that isn't simply rooted in observation. And she goes on, this is Rowe, if we relinquish the post-direct cinema assumption that documentary equals unobtrusive filming, there is no reason animation is not as valid a representational strategy for documentary as other techniques used in theatrically released documentaries. For example, the stylized reconstructions seen in the films of Errol Morris, and we of course looked at clips from Errol Morris's 1988 film The Thin Blue Line, and the poetic visual strategies of Elisa Barbash and Lucian Casting Taylor in Sweetgrass, and Leviathan, of course, Leviathan directed by Lucian Casting Taylor and Verena Paravel, which we actually watched last week. She goes on to further write, animated documentaries entail an absence and an excess, right? So we want to think about these two key terms, absence and excess. An absence of the live-action visual material one might expect to find in a conventional documentary, and an excess in the form of multifarious applications of animation that can be adopted as a representational strategy, whether the animation is photorealistically reconstructing prehistoric life, as we'll see in the BBC series Walking with Dinosaurs, for example, which was first released in 1999, or expressively evoking subjective, conscious, or perhaps even unconscious states. It is something that must be contended with and processed by the viewer in their reception of the film and their interpretation of its meaning. So animation seems inside of the documentary to, on the one hand, speak to an absence of something, and we might see it as the absence of the sort of indexical recording of actual bodies, actual time and space recorded by the camera, the event itself, observation, and so forth, on the one hand. So there's this, it speaks to this absence. Animation fills in perhaps for this absence. And then, of course, it provides this quote-unquote excess, right? The excess of the working over on the image, its constructedness, its artificiality, and so forth. So then she goes on that typically animation is used to convey subjects that are beyond the reach of live-action film, be that due to spatial, historical, or psychological proximity. Furthermore, while it may be impossible to film the far corners of the solar system, or prehistory, or someone else's subjective conscious experiences, such things are open to representation or evocation via animation. This notion of evocation, Honus Rowe further explores in the supplementary reading I asked for you to possibly consider reading for this week. Finally, or not finally, but going on, Rowe writes that animation goes beyond, however, just visualizing unfilmable events. It invites us to imagine, to put something of ourselves into what we see on screen. That is, to make connections between non-realist images and reality. Animation is quite simply doing something that the conventional live-action material of documentary cannot. I suggest that this is a fruitful way to think about the animated documentary, to consider how the animation functions in the documentary context. This is a way of thinking about the unique epistemological potential of the animated documentary in itself. So animation in the documentary, right, as Rowe's pointing out here, can demonstrate things for us that are of the real world but couldn't have necessarily been captured on film. And we'll see a number of instances of this further on in our discussion. But this could, of course, be something that's deep in the deep past, hundreds of years ago, before photography, of course, before cinema was invented, but it can nevertheless visualize events from the historical or prehistorical world, right? But they're nevertheless, in some sense, real events in a way, and they are of the world. but it is also can also take us into interior experiences, or visualize interior experiences, represent interior experiences, psychological processes, and so forth, that otherwise wouldn't have any, that are either impossible or difficult to visualize, but nevertheless, in a sense, real. And so for Honus Rowe, she is consistently making this claim for how animation can expand the epistemological potential, as she puts it, of the documentary, right? And epistemology, of course, is the study of knowledge and how we know the world, right? So animation can participate in expanding the vocabulary, the aesthetic and stylistic possibilities of documentary to produce knowledge and ways of knowing the world in the documentary film or media. So then she says, interestingly, what for her constitutes an animated documentary. And there's basically three key attributes. The first is that it has been recorded or created frame by frame, right? So this includes both, constructing cellular, drawings on a page that can be animated on, or like as in traditional cell animation, but it could also be constructed on a computer using an animated animation software, or it could, of course, also be things like stop motion or claymation, as it's called. As we'll see, also one of our examples, claymation, which is, of course, shot frame by frame. It's the recording of objects or models, and then being manipulated and to produce the, as it were, illusion of movement by this frame by frame animation. Second, animated documentary is about the world rather than a world wholly imagined by its creator, which is, of course, a reference to that distinction by Bill Nichols. It is about the world rather than a world wholly imagined by its creator. And finally, an animated documentary has been presented as a documentary by its producers and or received as a documentary by audiences, festivals, or critics. So this is where that question of media ecology becomes particularly important, because we have not only the aesthetic and stylistic attributes on the side of production or on the side of reception of how we see the documentary, but the way it's also distributed, packaged, curated, and so forth, in festivals and online or on platforms like Netflix and so forth, right? These are classifications like the documentary, and of course animation in the documentary, as we see on Netflix, is becoming increasingly prevalent. And so finally, Rowe goes on to argue that the use of animation within otherwise live-action documentary continues today, and animated sequences are often used as a communicative aid to clarify, explain, illustrate, and emphasize. Animated diagrams, charts, graphs, and maps are so commonplace now in mainstream formats such as current affairs broadcasting and theatrical documentary as to be unremarkable. So we can have, what she's pointing out is, we could have the use of animation inside of a non-fiction context, not necessarily a documentary film, but just a non-fiction context. This can include anything from, as she points out, the nightly news, something you may watch on CNN, or animated graphics in a bank machine, or in some other form of digital interface. The use of animation to illustrate something in a non-fiction communicative context, right? So we can look now at a few examples of animation deployed in a non-fiction context. One of the earliest is the use of animation in a map to map the movement of troops and the procession of war during the early parts of the First World War in Percy Smith's 1915 film Fight for the Dardanelles. The film is otherwise composed of live-action material, newsreel material, indexical images, but it illustrates a particular argument inside the film through the use of animation. But we would not say that the film is, of course, it is not entirely an animated documentary, right? We also have, similarly, in Frank Capra's series Why We Fight, such as Prelude to War from 1942, again, the use of animation and maps, in this case showing us the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, to demonstrate their, to provide propaganda value, symbolic value to these, these, at the time, enemy combatants of the Allied forces, right? We also have, of course, Disney during World War II produced a number of documentaries that used animation in a nonfiction context. They were not entirely animated documentaries. They deployed animation inside of films that otherwise used live action, but they would use instances of animation to help illustrate, graph, and so forth a particular argument, such as in Disney's 1943 film Victory Through Air Power. Also, just as another example, one of the health and education films that Disney produced also during the war, entitled The Winged Scourge from 1943, illustrates the way that disease is communicated via mosquito bites, right? And we see here, of course, in the lower frames, illustration of how germs are spread through the mosquito stinger. Now, more recently, we have works like a production from 2015 by Slate Magazine, which was produced by Andrew Kahn and entitled The Atlantic Slave Trade in 2 Minutes. And I'm just going to read here from the website that says, quote, that this infographic, gives you a sense of the scale of the transatlantic slave trade across time, as well as the flow of transport and eventual destinations. The dots that you see here traveling from the African continent to the so-called New World, both the southern parts of what has come to be called Latin America, as well as North America above it. These dots, which represent individual slave ships, also correspond to the size of each voyage. The larger the dot, the more enslaved people on board. And if you pause the map and click on a dot, you'll learn about the ship's flag. Was it British, Portuguese, French? Its origin point, its destination, and its history in the slave trade. The interactive animates more than 20,000 voyages cataloged in the Transatlantic Slave Trade database. So what would perhaps be otherwise difficult, if not impossible, to represent the magnitude of the Atlantic slave trade can through this interactive, as Slate refers to it, or this infographic, this animated infographic, can in a highly effective, arguably highly effective, by a highly effective method, can condense something of this magnitude into the space of 2 minutes, right? Which might perhaps otherwise exceed representation. Of course, we could have a narrative film or a play or a written text about such an event, but the use of animation here in this interactive perhaps is more effective at also communicating some sense of this sheer, as I said, sheer magnitude and scale of the transatlantic slave trade. So I will just let this play out a little bit longer so you can see how this animation works to illustrate this information. Okay, so Honus Rowe then turns to articulating how we start to begin to see the convergence of animation and nonfiction into a cohesive whole, an animated documentary, not just animation inside of a documentary, but an animated documentary where you couldn't, even if you were to remove the animation from the documentary itself would cease to function as such. And so she draws our attention to perhaps the earliest example of the animated documentary as a cohesive unit, as a totality, which is, of course, Winsor McCay's The Sinking of the Lusitania, which was a 10-minute animated account of the sinking of a British passenger ship by a German submarine in 1915. Paul Ward has written about the sinking of the Lusitania in his essay Animated Realities, the Animated Film, Documentary, and Realism, writing that the film, quote, resembles a newsreel in its representation of movement and the shading of the action. The overall tone of the film, despite some rather hysterically propagandistic intertitles, is somber and portentous. We are meant to believe and understand the events as real and of historical importance. Hence the strikingly different animation style, a style that has been described by Paul Wells as, quote, part informed speculation, part quasi-newsreel, part propaganda, unquote. So we have this appeal to realism by the filmmakers, and this appeal to realism, this appeal to the film being a record, as it were, of this event, this otherwise unrecorded event, right? This event that no one was there to film or photograph, the sinking of the Lusitania. We nevertheless have the film in its style and in its epistemology, right? Its aesthetics and its epistemology, saying it is, in a sense, a record of this event. It is about this real event. It is of this real event. As was put it in Bioscope, the producers, the studio that helped produce this film in 1919, witnessed the whole tragedy from the moment of the first attack to the heart-rending ending. And as one of the intertitles in the film puts it, from here on you are looking at the first record of the sinking of the Lusitania. And so these images, the realism, the detail of the waves, of the ship, of the sky, in the film's the animation's movements, all of it is rooted in a kind of realist, naturalist depiction of the stuff of the real world, the stuff of this event, of the sinking of this ocean liner, right? So there is this kind of realism and this realist appeal in the animation, and it's making this claim to being, as it were, a record of this event. Now, just to very quickly move through some other examples, however, that may not always be rooted in the realist form of animation, but nevertheless are of the real world. We could think of, for example, the British filmmaker originally from New Zealand, Len Lai's 1937 film Trade Tattoo, which among other things uses abstract animation or simple geometric forms and symbols like stars and so forth, as well as fragments of text, as we see here on the right, the word rhythm, in these largely abstract films. Nevertheless, making this film, for example, is about the post office and is about the uses of the post office in building a better, in this case, a better Britain, right? So there's a social function that's being used by this experimental animation that's participating in a kind of civic consciousness. We have, of course, in the 1960s, John and Faith Hubley made a number of films, animated films of a very personal nature, such as 1968's Windy Day, which uses these very sort of childlike watercolors and drawings of their two daughters, John and Faith Hubley's two daughters, and it combines these watercolors that are then, still drawings that are then sort of made to move through traditional animation techniques of cell animation, right, shooting one frame at a time and then producing this animation effect, brings that together with audio recording of the two children talking about their dreams, their hopes for the future, meditations on aging even, and so forth. And then, of course, one of the films I asked you to watch, Creature Comforts, which was produced by Nick Park and won an Oscar, I believe, in 1989. This claymation short, directed by Park for Aardman's Animation Studios, I would argue is a coherent conjunction of documentary and animation, or animated documentary, precisely in how it uses the animation to denaturalize the testimonies of average Britons about how they experience their modern domestic spaces. The film highlights what is normally taken for granted about not only the experience of domestic living, but how normal Britons express, that is to say, talk about that experience, the experience of living in apartments, suburban homes, city apartments, and so forth. By putting their words, these average Britons' words, in the mouths of claymation animals and pens at the zoo, the film reveals the strange public dimension of discussing one's private domestic life, the life of the creature that resides in the privacy and unspeakability of the modern citizen's household, right? So this is a coherent conjunction of animation inside of a kind of documentary form that isn't just using this animation for the sake of cuteness, which I think the film is undoubtedly cute, but also to perhaps the use of the animation itself, these creatures in these pens, also then I think reveals to us something about the modern life, to put it very simply. Now, in a completely different way, in a very realist sense, Walking with Dinosaurs, a film series I already mentioned, that was produced by the BBC in 1999, uses digital, highly realistic, photorealistic digital images to construct the prehistoric world of dinosaurs, and to, as it were, produce these observational portraits of the lives of dinosaurs. And of course, humans were not present, um, when dinosaurs were around. So there is another sort of sense of animation filling in for this absence, right? But nevertheless, this animation is rooted in a kind of hyper-realist claim to depicting what the world would have been like and what these events would have been like at that time. In contrast, we could look at a work like Jacqueline Goss's 2007 Stranger Comes to Town, a work of machinima, which is to say animation that uses and redeploys, that appropriates video game graphics, in this case World of Warcraft, and the avatars that we would have in those video games, and then to put words, to use them as documentary subjects and to put words in their mouths and then to construct a narrative. In this case, in Stranger Comes to Town, this becomes a film with these World of Warcraft monsters like orcs, to produce a kind of political documentary about border control, right? Borders of nations, modern nations. And the film then resonates in all of these ways with these, monsters that are interstitial figures that then also come to be telling us about real world geopolitical structures and struggles. We could also think about a very important film and complicated film, troubling film, Waltz with Bashir, produced by Ari Folman in 2008, which was about the Sabria Shatila massacre that occurred during the 1982 Lebanon War. As Annabelle Holmes-Rowe puts it in her essay, Absent Success and Epistemological Expansion. This is one of those films that engages with the personal memories of the filmmaker. It uses animation as a tool to explore and reveal hidden or forgotten pasts, demonstrating the medium's capacity for documenting the world from a subjective point of view. Ari Folman, the filmmaker's personal journey to unearth suppressed memories of his role in the Sabra and Shatila massacre, resonates thematically via the style of animation and the film's refusal to make an aesthetic distinction between past and present. Jeffrey Scholar, in an issue of Documentary of Animation, the journal Animation, in his essay Making It Unreal, has also written of the film, saying that, quote, with its visceral, hand-drawn color imagery and strange movement, Waltz with Bashir at once locates viewers in the space of the war and releases them into their own imagination. The film becomes a mnemonic, that is to say, a memory device, that activates our embodied engagement with the filmic text and constitutes an active participation in the war's collective perception. But he goes on. This is one of the other tricks of thinking about animation, the politics of the use of animation. He goes on, while this kind of argument that animated documentary, in its departure from indexical documentation, right, from being, as it were, strictly observational, from actually capturing bodies, right, photographing actually real bodies that existed in the world, and it's shifting away toward subjective perception and phantasmagorical imagining, subjectivity, psychology, and so forth. It can enhance our experience of war, deepening the richness and density of the depiction of complex events by showing what cannot be seen by the naked eye. But it can also thin out our comprehension, erasing the realities of an event and their inconvenient truths. And this is the really important thing, I think, that Scholar says, quote, the move away from the indexical trace toward the animated construction of the subjective space of war is seen in Waltz with Bashir, in which the hermetic world of individual war trauma, right, the very highly specific and particularized experience of war by one individual who is particularly traumatized and has repressed their memories, as Ari Folman has. This, according to Scholar, quote, avoids any political engagement with the war, because we are given these sort of, this look into the interiority, the subjectivity of Ari Folman, right, an Israeli soldier at the time. But we, in the film, in Waltz with Bashir, are never given any kind of access to the interiority, the subjective experience, or so forth of the Palestinian people, for example. And so this is one, perhaps, of the troubling uses of animation, one of the ones, perhaps the one-sidedness of it, and we always need to be alert to that as we enjoy animated documentaries. Okay. So this takes us very quickly to what I'm calling the media ecology of animated documentary. So Honus Rowe draws on the work of theater scholar Baz Kershaw, and argues that ecology, this term ecology, references the interrelationships of all the organic and non-organic factors of ecosystems. And ecology is also often defined as the interrelationships between organisms and their environments, especially when that is understood to imply interdependence between organisms and environments. And what we can do here is take this notion of ecology in some sense as a kind of metaphor, but also as a way of mapping and thinking about the relationship between individual animated documentary productions and their contexts of production, their contexts of distribution, their contexts of exhibition, and finally the context of consumption or reception, right? So animation in the documentary works on the level of production that we have just been describing, as well as on the levels of distribution. It could be in film festivals, but also, and how is it traveling? Is it traveling as a film print? Is it traveling as digital files? Is it beamed by satellite and so forth? But is it also exhibited? Is it exhibited in film festivals and global film festivals, local film festivals? And is it also exhibited on the internet? YouTube and I believe Vimeo have different animated documentary channels at this point, right? So all of these things together, production, distribution, exhibition, and consumption, kind of combine to form this ecology in Honus Rowe's sense. And so she points out that, quote, the emergence of animated documentary as a cohesive form in the 1990s, when it really consolidated itself, was concurrent with changes in audiovisual media production, distribution, and exhibition, unquote, at that time, right? So it was really in the 1990s that the form of animated documentary in terms of popular consciousness consolidated itself, okay? And we can think about what are some of the social, historical, industrial reasons that animation and the documentary sort of came together into this totality finally by the 1990s, right? And among other things, it had to do with the emergence of digital media. It had to do which then, as Honus Rowe points out, possibly contributed to what we might see as the democratization, the popularization, the ability of many different people to do it, even without professional training or who didn't study it at school, to perform animation. And they could do so through software that was developed in the 1990s and we continue to use on our personal computers to this day, things like iMovie and Adobe Flash. But also, not only was more digital animation and documentary animation produced partly through this democratization, but more people were also seeing it via sites like YouTube and Vimeo, which were sites like that and anticipated other types of sites that were anticipating it in the 1990s, as well as, of course, specialty television stations, cartoon networks, and things like that. And finally, she points out that things like crowdfunding, have also contributed to the increasing prevalence and the making and reception and understanding and investment in both on the part of producers and viewers, as well as on the parts of film festivals into the animated documentary. Okay, so this takes us then to the end of part one. I look forward to discussing the second part with you momentarily. Thanks.